about being back in a different way. I want to bring you back in time for a moment. The year is 1977. It's around this time of year. It's in the spring, actually the May long weekend. And something special happened. Does anybody know? Star Wars was released, A New Hope, in the movie theaters. All right, now you'll remember. Some of you probably like, maybe, I can't see him talking about that in church. Well, I'll tell you why. I remember seeing it in the summer at some point. I just remember, I think it was at the drive-in. I remember seeing the big lizard. I would have been the dewback, the big lizard creature. I probably would have been like almost 3.5 years old, around there. So you can imagine, as I grew up and got to see The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi right through my childhood, and then nothing until over a decade later, until 1999. I was in Bible college. I was working at Toys R Us, and big news. The new Star Wars film is coming out. Okay? So this was episode 1. The Phantom Menace was coming out. And some of my coworkers said, Jamie, we're going to go get some tickets. Would you like to come? And I said, of course I'd like to go to that. Well, you got to go line up. Just for tickets? Yep. No, I'm good. I have a little more patience. I'll wait a week. And they came back and they said, good news, we ended up getting an extra ticket for you. I said, great. What time do I need to be there? Show up at 5 o'clock and we'll get you your ticket. So I'm thinking, okay, a couple hours, I can wait for that. Showed up at 5, get the ticket. We were already back in line, maybe over halfway, just, not quite 3/4, but between the halfway and 3/4 mark in the line. And I look at the ticket and it says it starts at midnight. I said, wait a minute, I thought I was here for 7 o'clock show, maybe 9, not a midnight showing. Well, I'm here already. And there had been people at the front of the line. Now this is before you could get assigned seating. You can't order online at this time, right? So you line up, and there are people who had camped out overnight the day before, and they were right at the front, dressed up. Well, the husband was in a Chewbacca outfit, and the wife, she was pregnant, she was into Yoda. I'll never forget the front of the line. And then there was some people with lightsabers. The news was there and everything. It was a pretty big ordeal. They even had security so no one could jump in front in line. Okay, so fast forward now to the gates open, the doors open, and there is a loud roar, a cheer, and everybody's pushing in. And of course we're looking, there's like 4 or 5 of us. We're like, how are we going to find seats? Just grab whatever you can. Okay, so we get in and we grab, they weren't the best seats, they weren't the front row, but they were kind of like a little closer to the front, near the middle, on the edge. I remember I had an edge seat. But what shocked me was this woman and her husband who were at the front of the line. You see, they were still looking for the best seat. They were going all around because they had first pick. But something must have happened where they didn't like the seat or didn't want the seat. And there were still lots of seats. But I could see that they were being picky. And so they ended up going to everybody in the row saying, would you let us sit here? My wife's pregnant. Could we sit here? And it's like, well, if there was a different reason for you needing this seat, but if it's just because you were waiting a long time and gave up being a little too picky, a lot of people are going to say no to that. And a lot of people did. And so there they were, walk of shame down to the front row, looking straight up in the front row for the movie. Now, the reason why I say that is let's rewind time, because first of all, you're picky for your seats. We all are. Some of you want convenience. Some of you want privacy. You want to look at your phones in the back row. And some of you want perfection. You want the middle, so surround sound. Some of you even measured the distance for the screen for the best viewing distance. I know, some of you are like that. And, I got my own reasons for where I like to sit. We're picky. Maybe it's comfort, maybe it's convenience, whatever. There's a story in Luke 14 about some picky people and where they were sitting and seated. It was probably like a church service like this. It was a Sabbath, and many Jews on Sabbath would go to synagogue. And Jesus was invited to a prominent Pharisee's house. This is in Luke 14. And as he's there, the Pharisees, they were looking at a way to get Jesus. So they were testing him. And there were some other people there. They were this prominent Pharisees and other teachers of the law and pretty respectable, important people. And there was an individual there who had fluid buildup in his limbs. And, sometimes that happens if you have liver problems, stuff like that. And it can be painful and very difficult to live with. And Jesus asked him, he was going to heal this guy. Jesus said, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Because he knew it would be a problem for them. And then he goes on to say, if one of you has a son or even one of your own oxen and it falls into a pit, wouldn't you help it out? You would. And so Jesus heals this man. This causes some problems. Now that's the setting. But what's interesting is that Jesus noticed how picky they were with their seeding. We read right after that Jesus had a lesson for them. So here's the story in Luke chapter 14. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? What if your son or ox falls into a well? Will it not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath? And then he told them a parable to those who were invited. When he noticed how they would choose the best places for themselves. We got to get to that dinner party early. Come on, don't be late. Get your hair done. We got to go. We got to get the best seat in the house. We don't want to look at like we're not important. We don't want to be at the back. We want to hear good conversation. That Pharisee, they know some pretty high people. Maybe we'll get, some more business, or maybe they'll give us something in life. There's different reasons we have for where we want to sit and who we want to sit with. And it's no different going way back to Jesus' day. And so Jesus begins to teach them. And he tells them this story, teaches them with this. So he says, when you're invited to a wedding banquet, don't sit in the place of honor, because a more distinguished guest, someone who's also been invited, who really is more distinguished than you are, they may take your place. Jesus said that the host, the one who invited both of you, may come and say to you, give your place to this other man. And then in humiliation, you go and sit at the lowest seat. But instead, Jesus said, when you're invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when the one who invites you comes and they'll be like, friend, move up higher. And then you will be honored in the presence of all the guests. For everyone who exalts himself, verse 11, will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. This is not the first time Jesus talked about the first and the last, the least and the greatest, is it? Jesus talked about the first and the last, the least and the greatest many times. But here Jesus is again, he's in Jerusalem. This has been some time after he's taught for a while, and he's noticing just how people do this even with seating. And so Jesus is trying to teach them, be careful. If you are one who thinks you deserve a prominent seat, if you're someone in life that thinks you are a somebody, be careful. God may humble you. And to those who are pushed to the very end, to those who it appears are not important, you are special to God. Jesus knows your name. He sees you. And there's a reason that you've been created. And he will exalt you. It was interesting. I was reading a book this week. This is a very difficult concept to grasp. And this book that I was reading was talking about pride. And it talked about the song that Willie Nelson sung, which I hadn't heard. I had to go look it up. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in many ways. And he also mentioned a quote, I'm humble and I'm proud of it. Or the person who jokes with his friend, have you read my book on humility and how I attained it? And these are kind of jokes that float around out there. Dave Knutson always used to talk about the sermon, and how after the sermon there was a guy, he would always come up to the preacher and say, good job. They really needed to hear it. It was never, I needed to hear that. It was always, good job. Everyone needs to hear that lesson. And that can be our attitude. We might not even know it. Look at the apostles. Those 12 that were walking with Jesus for 3 years, they never thought that they needed, to be humble. But yet, Jesus, on the night that he was about to be betrayed, at the Last Supper, he's washing their feet. Why? Jesus said, you call me teacher and Lord, rightfully so. So if I, your teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet, because they wouldn't do it. They were too proud. They were above that. That's a servant's job. For I have given you an example, Jesus said, that you also should do just as I have done for you. A servant is no greater than his master. A messenger no greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. God warns us about pride and our place or position in life all through the Old Testament. Look at stories like Nabal and how proud he was, like who is David and what God did to him. Or Jesus talking about the rich man who thinks, I got everything, I'm going to sit back and enjoy life, and this very night your life will be taken from you. Remember that they also, no matter how big you think you are, you're a small potato in the grand scheme of things. They also, that masters, rulers also have a master and a ruler. Kings also have a king that they're under. And so we read, as Paul reminds us, masters, remember, you know that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. You're under God's authority. Masters, deal with your slave justly and fairly, since you know that you too have a master in heaven. You too will be judged. Be careful how you treat others. And of course, Daniel reminds us, for it's God who removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those of understanding. It's God who gives, and it's God who can take away. We will all answer and stand before the Lord. You know, so many times we have a lot of problems with our attitude and with judging without even realizing it. I'm sure many of those people, even the disciples following Jesus around, they probably thought they were above that. I remember being downtown Toronto. We used to go there with some students every year. We'd take some trips to Niagara and Toronto. Some students went up the CN Tower, and I was waiting at the bottom with a few students myself. And there was some homeless coming and asking for money, and I got into some conversations, and we started talking to one of these young fellas. And I said, it must be really tough living out here on the street. And he said, it's not so bad. He was probably in his, I say young now, he was older than I was, but he was probably in his 30s. He said, no, it's not too bad living out here physically. He said, do you want to know what the worst part of it is? He says, with these guys dressed in their fancy suits walk past you and call you a piece of trash. And to hear that, that sunk in, that got me thinking, who are we to think that anyone is a piece of trash in life? We have no control, and I mentioned this a few weeks ago. You have no control over the genes you were born with, the part of the world you were born into, the family you were brought into, what your family taught you. Some of you learned 3 or 4 languages when you were young. Your families raised you and taught you, and you have these extra gifts to go on when you're older. The languages and the culture that you were born into. You have no control over the time in history to which you were born. There are many things that we have been given, and to those that don't have those things, there's also a reason, and God wants to remind us that you are special, you are important. Remember what Paul says as he writes to the church in Corinth? To those in the church, they're arguing about who has the better gifts, and even in the church we can have this attitude of, I'm better than someone else, I'm more important than others. And Paul reminds them, it's the parts of the body that seem like they're not as important that God thinks, that elevates, God uses the most. And that's how God works. The things of this world, he teaches, he teaches us lessons using things we would never expect. The blind man in John chapter 9 opened our eyes to what God was doing in his life. But we have a problem in judgment. Some people say that we're born with this. They say that, there's reasons why we look at people and we instantly judge them. And, sometimes our brains take a shortcut. We're like, okay, we want to learn about this person. And there's this thing about, this first impression. But do you know that good-looking people have an advantage in life? It shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it is. If you were born with good genes and good looks, you have an advantage. It's called the halo effect. The halo effect says that, it looks at one characteristic, one trait, and because of that, people will have they'll judge you differently. Here's some of the studies that have proven that these are just a few things that are different with those who are attractive in life. Attractive people are more likely to be hired and promoted. They make more money than others, and their performance reviews, evaluations are always better. Or not always, but often. Higher salaries. The legal system, there's been studies. Again, this was a study from 2003, the first one. In the 1980s, they did studies on the legal system. People would have, their sentences would be different than those who were convicted for the similar crimes. Education, teachers gave higher marks to those who look better. And social interaction. People were more willing to stop and help someone at the side of the road because of their looks, or to talk to them and to give them an opportunity just because of the way that they look. That's what we do as humans. We treat people who look better differently. Now, what about people who have money? What about people who have power or fame? We treat people differently. This is just with looks. Humans do this. And the opposite is also true. When someone doesn't take care of themselves, messy hair, dirty clothes, poor hygiene, it triggers negative judgments from people. Even if they can't, they're not good, they don't understand social norms or social cues. So they have a negative judgment. People often assume they're lazy or lack of intelligence or lack of discipline. They have reduced credibility and reduced trustworthiness. First impression, often within the first few seconds, if someone hasn't groomed themselves well, they have a negative first impression. If someone doesn't look good. Now, I want you to think about that. If you're born with, you're not extremely good looking and people are judging you, maybe you haven't learned good hygiene or whatever, and people are judging you poorly, and everyone's treating you a little worse, don't you think that you're going to have a bad attitude in life? And all of a sudden, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that people think you're angry all the time because you just have this angry look, but you're not. That's just the way you look. And so people treat you differently, and next thing you know, you are angry. Next thing you know, you are a difficult person to deal with because life gave you a bad set of cards, so you would think, or how it would appear. And the opposite can also be true. When you're attractive, you think everything's good, and everybody's nice to, and everything. But sometimes it's those people that all of a sudden they turn and you see what's really inside, and you're shocked. And so Jesus is saying we have to be careful of how we judge. That's how the world judges. But as a church, as God's people, be careful how we judge one another. Because God doesn't look at the outer appearance or the hygiene. God doesn't look at how someone was raised and their abilities and their situation in life. God looks at their heart. And this passage from the Old Testament, they're bringing forth, surely this is going to be, and God's like, no, stop looking at the outside. God looks at the heart. And of course, Peter reminds us too, because humans look at the jewelry and the gold and the cars and the houses and the clothing and the smells. We look at all that stuff, but God doesn't. And God reminds us that what's important is a gentle and quiet spirit, which is in great worth in God's sight. How do we change our inside? Jesus, number one, Jesus will help us do that. Jesus was helping them, and Jesus will help us. For example, just in Jesus' life, or even in the stories that are included in Scripture, you look at the blind man. I talked about that in John 9. Look at the disciples that he chose. He didn't choose the elite of society. Although with Paul, it's not that they weren't important, that they weren't invited, not that they weren't disciples, they were. But Jesus stood out. He chose fishermen. He chose that adulterous woman to go to the Samaritans, the one that was rejected. The community he grew up in, he chose to grow up in Nazareth. I mean, that's where Father, Son, and Spirit, this plan to come to earth. He came, into a humble family, into a place, and the Jews were like, has anything good come out of Nazareth? I mean, it was in nowhere. It should have been Jerusalem. But no, he came, grew up in Nazareth, born in Bethlehem, grew up in Nazareth. And of course, his death on a cross and the curse that comes with those who were to be nailed to a tree. Jesus wants us to open our eyes because the world looks at Jesus and said, this is no king. The world will look at Jesus and say, this makes no sense. The cross is foolishness to so many people. but it's the power of God in salvation, as we read in Scripture. So Jesus wants to help us to see past that as he did then. And if you think that judgment's not that important, you see, this isn't just a story of where you sit at the table. This isn't just a story of, of pride and humility. This is a story of judgment, a story of who you're going to associate with, who you're going to reach out to in life. Don't think it doesn't affect discipling. Many of us, there's people in life that are difficult. The people in life who've not been taught social norms, who stand too close in your face, have bad breath, who are disgusting with the way they eat and the way they were brought up. That's not necessarily their fault. That's maybe the way they were brought up. They're frustrating or annoying. They do embarrassing things. They speak too loud. Maybe they don't recognize, or they speak when they're not supposed to. The takers in life, who they're just always taking. They don't have anything to give you. All they have is they want your time. And so we would call these people sometimes draining or sapping of energy. They show no appreciation, some of these people. They show no appreciation, and they have nothing to give you when you're good to them. They can't show appreciation even if they wanted to, other than a thank you. Those people whose names no one remembers. Are we discipling them? I'm not saying that's all we disciple. Of course not. I mean, Jesus isn't saying that. God's not saying everyone else isn't important. But are they on our radar? Are the ones at the end of the table on our radar? Because that story of the seating and sitting with that Pharisee and that story Jesus told about the greatest and the least, it didn't end there. There's one more part to that. You see, Jesus also said to those who invited him, when you give a lunch or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers and sisters and relatives, your rich neighbors, because they might invite you back and you get repaid. On the contrary, when you host a banquet, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. You give your life to helping people like this, and this is a trust in God. This is your faith. Because you're going to give so much of your life and your time, and you look back and say, where did it all go? What did I get from it? And you have to trust that Jesus is telling the truth, that Jesus is who he said he is, and that he will bless you at the resurrection of the righteous. Because he wants us to do this. He's called us to do this. He has shown us how to do this. This is who we should be, different from the world, judging people from a different way, from their hearts, and that they are all special, made in God's image. And be careful that we don't present ourselves as too proud to associate with them. That's what Paul says. Do not be proud. Instead, associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own estimation. See, it's not about only reaching out to that group of people, but it's about changing our attitude so that we're not embarrassed to be around people who the rest of the world might be embarrassed to be around. That there are those people at our tables. There are those people in our church. There are those people in our lives. We have time for them. It's not saying all our time has to go, but do not overlook them. Because guess what? Jesus, growing up, the son of a carpenter in a poor little village of Nazareth, no-name town, how many people could have had Jesus sit at their table and invited him over after a Sabbath, for a Sabbath dinner, after a synagogue meeting? And maybe they did. No, I don't want to invite that poor family. They have nothing to give me. And they could have had the king of the universe at their table that day. So who are we missing out on by not inviting them to our table, to our community, inviting them to the Lord's table, bringing them to know the Lord because they need him more than ever, more than we can know. So open our hearts, be patient, pursue humility, create connections for the less fortunate. And I'll end on this. I remember hearing this. It's not well documented, but I remember this story that was told in I was in Bible college when I heard it, when I first heard it. You've probably heard something similar. But it was a story of a professor who was of a seminary school, they were Bible students, and they were coming for their final exam. And it wasn't for a few hours, but the students were out studying, and the professor decided, before the exam, he would dress up as a homeless individual, as a person that, would come across, and he messed his hair up, and he wore terrible, ripped up clothing, and he smelled terrible, and he just went around to try and talk to the students who didn't have time for him. And it's said that the teacher graded them based on how they responded to him when he was in the yard that day. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But I suspect that there would be some truth to many people not having time for someone in a position like that in life. May we not be like the world. May we be not followers of the world, but leaders of the world, and show them that God in his wisdom has designed us all differently, and that there's great value in all our differences, from those who seem great in the world's eyes to those who seem least. And the least, the last shall be first. Let us not forget that. Let's stand as we sing our final hymn.